Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. It is David Boucher, the Real Time Show's resident provocateur, back at you with another article. Now, usually I tend to address general trends in the business and tends to be relatively evergreen. But today I want to combine that with something that's quite topical, and that is Watches and Wonders 2024. I'm recording this basically at the end of the show, and though I was not on site like Rob and Alan were, I get the distinct impression that the luxury watch industry is only further doubling down on the luxury part of that description. I don't know about you. I loved a ton of watches that were released, but it is very unlikely that I will be able to afford any of them. And I want to talk about that today. Just how good is it for the long-term health of the business that only a more and more concentrated group of people seems to be served? As usual, I'd love for you to get in touch with us with various different means, which I'll share at the end of the show. We'd love to hear your feedback and thoughts, but without any further delay, let's just get right into it. I'm sure all of us, despite struggling to recall what we had for dinner yesterday, have a head full of random factoids we've picked up over our lifetimes, some dating back decades. I remember being about 12 years old when I read a book on ancient Egypt, at which point I found out that during the mummification process, Egyptians used to carefully conserve a person's heart, but discarded their brain with the help of a hook inserted up the deceased's nasal passages. The thinking, as I understood it, was that a person's soul was contained in their heart, while their brain didn't ultimately matter that much. It's a romantic, if slightly gory image, and I couldn't help but think of this emphasis on the heart over the brain when the waves of Watches and Wonders 2024 new releases started to wash over my news feeds. The comparison does indeed apply itself very well to watches. Watches that appeal to the heart are those that possess everything we love about watchmaking: superior finishing, unbelievably intricate mechanisms, and the finest of precious and exotic materials. They exist not so much to tell time, but rather to be beautiful expressions of human ingenuity that just so happen to tell the time as well. Watches that appeal to the brain are those that we use to justify the existence of mechanical watches in a world where time is everywhere. These are the Zins and Seikos that we buy because we tell ourselves that if an electromagnetic pulse ever hit our city, we'd still be able to tell the time, even at night and even after fighting off armed looters, because of their hardened cases, ample lume, and anti-magnetic hairsprings, all offered at a price that won't require sacrificing uncanned goods and ammo. I don't think it's controversial to say that in a balanced and healthy market, both should coexist. But Watches and Wonders 2024 is, to me, the most glaring example so far that just like in ancient Egypt, the brain of the watch industry is being completely discarded. As I scroll through my Watchicity feed, right now as I write this, at 2:52 p.m. on Tuesday, April 9th, I see, from the top of the screen down, the Grand Seiko Highbeat SLGH 021 Genbi Valley, 2 Roger Dubuis Excaliburs, the Hublot MP11 Water Blue Sapphire, the Parmigiani Fleury Toric Collection, and so on and so forth, without a pause. I have to scroll for quite some time over pages of Pateks and Langes to finally reach one watch, the new Tudor Black Bay GMT 58, that one could call approachable. On one hand, it's fantastic that all of these heart watches exist in the first place, and that human ingenuity can come up with so many beautiful things all at once. On the other hand, the fact that there seem to be more and more of them, or at the very least, that these are the watches apparently most worthy of attention at the expense of less extravagant models, is, to me, a problem. Here's an eye-opening statistic. According to a joint report written by Morgan Stanley and Lux Consult, watches with a retail price tag exceeding 25,000 Swiss francs, or about 27,000 US dollars, accounted for 69% of the growth in the Swiss watch sector in 2023. Let me rephrase that. Watches that approach the cost of a new car account for more than two-thirds of the growth of Swiss watch exports last year. That is insane. I sometimes wonder just how much of a broken record I sound like on these articles, because the same themes keep popping up over and over. And I'm back again to say that while I understand how and why the luxury watch industry is going in this direction, my hypothesis is that this is detrimental to the long-term health of the business. I hate to use myself as the only data point to make my case, but I'm very lucky to be in a very high income bracket in my country of France. My wife works as well, and though we love our 3 dogs as if they were our children, we have no children. and hopefully decades of earning power still left in us. If anyone should appear to be the target consumers for watches and wonders in any year, I think it's us. And yet, we did recently buy a house. It's nothing extravagant, and I believe it probably traded hands originally for about 100 francs and a wheel of cheese. We bought it from someone who got it for free, finalizing their inheritance the day before the sale to us. And unfortunately, they did not accept cheese as payment, only currency and a lot more than 100 francs. This, combined with the other costs of merely existing in 2024, mean that my watch budget is not nearly enough to even sniff at almost any of the models I've seen so far, let alone those announced years into the future if this trend continues. Even the new Zenith Defy Divers, watches that could be classified as tool watches, are priced well into the 5 figures. Sure, some of the Tudors are approachable, but doesn't it feel like you're being offered more or less the same thing by them every year? The bones Rolex throws at you while it makes watches like the totally not tailor-made for money launderers solid gold deep sea. Perhaps some people out there will hear this and offer the advice I come across so often when the upper classes talk about the misfortunes of those in lower income brackets. Bro, why you mad, bro? Why do you care? And why don't you just stop being poor? I'm not being facetious. This is the discourse, and I know this because my first Audicle on the Tiffany Signs Patek Philippe Nautilus started its life as a Reddit post, and this was a take that came up almost immediately. The problem as I see it is that data tells me that I'm very much not poor. I just don't have the kind of screw you and your great-great-great-grandkids money that's increasingly required to get really into watches. I don't lose any sleep over this, and clearly I will never be able to afford everything my heart desires. That's just life. However, it is disappointing to have the watch industry as a whole basically also telling me to stop being poor, because it makes for a less varied and diverse experience, and over time, I do find myself caring less and less about what the new releases are. There's a well-known trope in watch circles that 2,000 to 5,000 euros is the point at which you start being able to consider, quote, nice watches. That's already a considerable sum, life-changing money for a big chunk of the world, but let's assume that's the case. That is a very fun category to consider because big brands who want to play in this sandbox have to be quite clever and creative in how they work in their bells and whistles, as opposed to when money is no object. But honestly, how well was that bracket served at Watches and Wonders 2024? The trouble is that increasingly this sandbox is becoming empty. Consider that of the 54 brands exhibiting at the show, I have trouble identifying many that offer anything mechanical in that price range. Perhaps it's the case that people buying all of these heart watches have infinite amounts of cash to spend. But what if they don't? Or what if they do? Wouldn't it still behoove the luxury watch industry to encourage even more people to come into the fold so they can make even more money in the future as these new entrants become more seasoned collectors? Wasn't the Tissot PRX enough of a convincing argument that there is serious cash to be made in a volume play, aimed squarely at everyone who just wants to own something well-made at an attainable price? Maybe the industry still doesn't care, thinking I'm just a poor guy with a mortgage who doesn't matter. Perhaps. But again, from a long-term perspective, if my personal experience is any indication of a broader trend, I advise against this type of thinking. Years of being faced with such price escalations, only accelerated by the pandemic, have led me not only to become very comfortable with owning fewer watches, a topic we've covered in depth here on the show, but also to be a ruthless bottom feeder when it comes to actually purchasing watches. I do not buy from ADs or boutiques, and in fact, when I buy a watch, part of the game is using my decade and a half's worth of knowledge to find those models on the greer used markets that give me the most bang for my buck, or just simply the best price on a recently released model. Crucially, when someone comes to ask me about a big watch purchase, which last happened just a few weeks ago when a colleague was looking for a gift for her husband, I steer them to Chrono24 or Joma Shop and offer to review any listing they think happens to be the most advantageous for them over the boutique price. I can't be the only one doing this. How long before this snowballs well beyond just the data point of me, David Fauché, and becomes a much more serious problem for the luxury watch industry? Can you imagine that? A whole segment of the watch buying market that has been conditioned to actively disengage from the industry's primary retail channels. It's such a shame because it's my opinion the watch brands sit in a particularly advantageous position on which to build some very tangible goodwill. From the bottom up, from a larger segment of consumers than they are currently serving. In a world where increasing numbers of consumers talk about the enshittification of everything, the watch industry is one of the holdouts, because even a, quote, cheap mechanical watch made today will likely outlast its owner if cared for properly. Maybe I'm being naive here, but if the industry cares so much about sustainability, could it not present itself as the last bastion of quality goods, rather than emphasizing somewhat gimmicky initiatives? To me, the watches themselves are the most sustainable aspect of the industry. And what if its major brands were the ones to start the snowball effect in consumers, who, when first faced with the robustness of a mechanical watch, also started to look for quality in all of the other categories in which they had previously settled for disposable options? It sounds like a pipe dream, but then again, is it? How many of you out there fell into watches and then started looking at all of your other possessions differently? The fact is, reliable, well-made, reasonably priced watches are exciting, just not in the same manner as a triple tourbillon, and I'll even go so far as to say that the former promises much more in terms of potential escapism and adventure than the latter. And yet, just like in the real world, the watch world's fortunes appear to be decided by an ever more concentrated pool of people with an ever-expanding pile of money. I'll close this out repeating myself again, calling back to a recent article I discussed with Alan and Rob, which leaned heavily on the approaches of industry legend Jean-Claude Biver. In the 1980s, after the decimation of the watch industry by the quartz crisis, Biver essentially saved it with one astute insight. Watches, which had previously been mostly used as essential tools to keep track of the time, could instead be seen not as objects of utility, but rather objects of desire. Now, we talk not so much about the watch industry, but rather the luxury watch industry. And today, 4 decades later, that focus on luxury seems to remain the underpinning philosophy. If the recent Watches and Wonders show is any indication, the luxury watch industry is similarly in its endpoint of concentrated decadence, targeted at a concentrated elite, the mirror image trajectory of late-stage capitalism and its associated enshittification of everything. So here's my suggestion, or really, rather, my request. Can we try swinging back the other way? I love hearing about watches like IWC's Eternal Calendar, and it's incredible that such objects exist. But when everything is priced like it, how can anyone be hopeful about Gen Z and beyond getting as hooked into watches as we are? Can the industry please go back to presenting watches not just as objects of desire that belong on the wrists of the very few, but rather useful items that can make your day just a little bit easier, brighter, and yes, more exciting? How luxury brands can alter course in that direction is a topic for another article, or 2, or 3. And perhaps what we're seeing now is just the tail end of the exuberance that has built up over the last 4 years. But I do hope that we reach an inflection point soon, because just like chocolate and Marvel superhero movies, even gold and diamonds and tourbillons get boring when that's all you have in front of you. And that is it for another article. I want to take the time to thank you so much for listening, and also invite you now to be the provocateurs by getting in touch with the show and sharing your thoughts and comments and feedback generally with us. You can do so in several ways. I can be reached on Instagram at DAVACHER. Rob can be reached at ROBNUDDS, and Alan can be reached at ALONBENJOSEPH. And of course, you can reach us on the show's dedicated handle, that is therealtime.show. We also love you going old school and getting in touch with us via the show's contact form on the website. The address for that is www.therealtime.show/contact. Thanks so much again for taking the time to listen. We really look forward to having you join us on future episodes of The Real Time Show.
All right, well, thanks, David. That was an incredible article, one of my favorites so far, and it brought back memories of last month's fair, Watches and Wonders 2024, and of course the associated events that took place at the Beau Rivage, Time to Watches at Head Genève, and also the AHCI at Iceberg in the center of Geneva. As always, we're going to sit around a table, the three of us, David, Alon, and me, and we're going to talk about the topics raised in that article. David, let's start with you. Firstly, kudos to the ancient Egypt analogy that you brought in there. I very much enjoyed that. what was the main feeling you had after you finished writing this article?
It's a tough thing because as I was writing it, I was wondering, I'm getting this feeling as a remote viewer, basically, and you two were there. And I always had this feeling of, am I off base? Is it a much more approachable vibe when you're on the streets of Geneva and talking to these brands? But I ended up settling on the fact that, regardless what the atmosphere was like at the show, ultimately, these watches are, when the rubber meets the road, these watches are unaffordable for me. And as I laid out in the article, I think I'm in a very privileged position compared to a lot of people, but it is basically out of the question in my current state that I can afford really almost any of these watches. And it's to the point now where I wrote this a couple weeks ago. I've had time to think about it. Obviously, longtime listeners will know that I've been on a trend of just trying to downsize my collection. And it's not that I'm less excited or less interested in watches, but I think the passion's gone a little bit because I understand that in life, not everything is attainable. Unless you're Jeff Bezos or Bernard Arnault, whatever. That's just life. But I think it's to the point where it seems like the watch industry is focusing on the 0.1 of 0.1% and to the detriment of it long term, I think. Alan, what do you think?
Thank you for an awesome article. Again, you keep on inspiring me. I even have written one, so hold your horses, dear Rob and David and dear listeners. I also love the metaphor of the ancient Egyptians, rather gorgy with the brains, but very, very well tied into the story. So you made a bold statement, which I'm going to come back to in a bit, about the approachability during the fair. So Dufour, the CEO of Rolex, really is trying to bring the industry together. He was adamant that Frederic Constant and Alpina came on board last year. Oris is there. This year, they added more of these, let's call them entry-level luxury watches, meaning Nomos, Norqain, Raymond Weil, Bremont. So it's definitely not six figures and above watch show. So I think that's a good thing. Now, you made a bold statement. You think the passion is gone. You mean your passion?
Yeah, no, I think so, in the sense that as much as I think it's phenomenal, like the eternal calendar, from a human point of view, it's amazing that humanity does these types of things. I mean, unfortunately, humans do bad things. They also do great things, and I think this is one of them. But it's hard to vocalize this, but given that it will never be possible to afford everything, I accept that. Knowing that I can't afford anything, basically. And I know there's some outliers that you mentioned, Alan, and not to take anything away from them. But sometimes when you want an IWC, you want an IWC. And if all the new releases are coming in at over 10,000 euros and above, it's discouraging, basically.
I think one of the interesting things that popped into my head while I was listening to the article was that rather than qualifying the brands we're talking about, or the brands you're mostly focusing on as like Watches of Wonders brands, because of course there are exceptions, as Alan pointed out, and maybe that's a good thing that Dufour is really pushing for more affordable brands to be present at the Palexpo. I think that it's worth categorizing the brands we're talking about here as I call them, reputational brands. So the kind of brands whose names known outside of the watch industry. So the IWCs, Omega weren't there, obviously, Swatch Group, but the Omegas of the world, the Zeniths, these brands that you expect or expected to be able to aspire to own one day, now getting out of the reaches of regular watch collectors, who themselves are not particularly regular people, but people who once upon a time could easily have said, I want to own a Tag Heuer Carrera one day, when it was 3,500, 4,000 or something like that. Still a huge amount of money to spend on a watch, but not like close to five figures. And I think every grand you add to a price tag makes it exponentially more unattainable. It isn't just a case of like, this watch is 3,000, so I can either buy two of these for my 6,000 budget or one 6,000 watch. Getting up to having 6,000 euros spare like available to spend on a product is exponentially harder than getting up to 3,000, I believe, like because stuff always comes along that gets in the way. And so for the people that maybe looked at the watchmaking industry from the outside in, many of the names that they recognized are now totally out of reach and look like they're not going to get any closer in reach. We did wonder what had happened to these brands and their pricing strategies immediately after COVID, when everybody stuck a zero on the back of their prices or so. It felt like, would they try and realign and bring themselves back down to earth? But it seems that they're doubling down on it and pushing further ahead with this strategy.
Yeah, and actually, as you're talking through these things, Rob, I think there's a lot of points that we can bring up on this conversation. One of which I want to get to later is kind of the retail and neo vintage and second aspect. But what I want to talk about now actually is an exception to what you just said, Rob. So I totally agree. We have to categorize things. I also want to mention, especially, I think Frederic Constant is on fire. They do fantastic stuff. The Raymond Weil Milesine, the moon phase, I think is beautiful. But one exception I want to bring up here is Hermes. So Hermes, longtime listeners will know I'm a huge fan of what they do and in kind of the specific category they play in. But their new watch, the Cut, was something like 5,000 euros. Now, I think it was a little bit plain. I'm more of a fan of the HC08. But even the HC08, those were priced around, if I'm not mistaken, something like 5,000 euros. Now, let's be clear. Like, that is a huge amount of money for most everyone in the world. But in the watch universe, this is Hermes. Like, this is the company that I think their pricing is pretty much pick a number, multiply it by 10, add a factor, and then just, round it up a little bit. Like, their pricing is almost so high as to be arbitrary. But like, you have a watch with an in-house movement, a specific design language from a huge name. And so I just think like that is worth calling out. And if Hermes did that, it has to be for a reason. And so I really hope they get some traction with that. And they show going forward that there is a way to maintain your brand equity and bring people into the watch game, or for those who are already in it, give them a really good product for the money.
So I think Hermes is a great example of something a little bit other. I don't think that it really qualifies in my mind as what I'd say was a reputational brand from a watchmaking perspective. Obviously, it's a huge name in the textiles industry and a massive, massive fashion house, globally respected for that. And even though people that know what Hermes has done on the watchmaking side of things respect them as a watchmaker, it's not the name that I think most people on the street who are thinking about buying a luxury watch to reward themselves for a new job or a significant milestone in life would go to. And another thing, they didn't go too crazy with the pricing throughout COVID. And it's probably just a timing thing. Just bear in mind, all of these watches that we're seeing released now have likely been in development for years. Like Rolex probably has its release calendar planned out for 30 or 40 years ahead, which is why we never get what we want, because they know when it's coming, and to hell with the rest of us. But Hermes didn't do what IWC did during COVID. When the Ingenieur came out, and it was priced at that, I still can't get over what it was priced at, like over 5 figures for a box standard Ingenieur with a closed case back. I was like, wow, this is just unpalatable. Hermes didn't put itself in that position. And now maybe some smart person at the decision-making end of the company has said, all right, well, we don't need to lower our prices to stabilize our catalog or our offering. We just need to stick where we are and we'll automatically be good value. And what you're pointing out here with the Cut is a perfect example, because it's not just a good value watch, relatively speaking, from a fashion house that has now become a respected watchmaker that could actually have charged $3,000 more, for example, and nobody would have batted an eyelid. It's also a very interesting design. Like, there's actually a bit of creativity in this. It's a little Streamliner-esque, if I want to point to anything else within the collection. It gives me some Cartier Ballon Bleu vibes as well for some weird reason. I don't know why, but it's a great looking watch. And, more power to one of your favorite brands, David. I love it.
With this Audicle, 3 things that are floating in my head for quite some time are coming together. So very interesting. Dufour, his comment that everyone exhibiting outside the Pal Expo fairgrounds, he called them pirates. So that's interesting. It seems almost that they are the livelihood of the watch industry, meaning, let's say, all those brands in Beau Rivage, the hotel, they were over 50 brands there, if I'm not mistaken. And many of them are more affordable. That being said, at Ace, the two other topics that I have to deal with are losing the heritage brands. So we become more independent and deal with more independent watch brands. And you see suddenly that the pricing structure is different and that some brands would love us to retail them, but they simply don't have the margin. So that is an interesting thing. So they can create more accessible pricing, but the margin is not there to do wholesale, retail, and even classic marketing. So that's something floating in my head, maybe an interesting topic for a new article. And thirdly, doing collabs, you see suddenly how these brands operate, what the difficulties are, what the strengths are, and opportunities are. So it begs the question also, David, because you address in the article where you help a colleague find a gift, right, in that price bracket. You either steer him to Chrono 24, but maybe it raises the question, why don't these brands speak to you that now fall into that price bracket? And you want, like you said, an IWC, for example. What is it that they need to do to make you aspire them, if you catch my drift?
Ooh, man, you got questions and comments there. One tangential thing to address it, and then I'll get to your main question. So one of our devoted listeners who also writes in with great feedback, Matt, made a point which is counter to something I said in my article. So I said that if Swiss brands, the established ones, the reputational ones, don't kind of address this, what used to be their bread and butter tier, they're going to get their lunch eaten by the micro brands. And what Matt said was, well, it's probably not the case because, it's not really where people want to go. And as you said, Alan, the money for marketing just isn't there. So I think the micro brands probably not as much of a threat as I was thinking. So what I think that still leaves as a big vacuum at these kind of lower tier price points. Now, to your point, or to your question, Alan, I've said many times, I've written many times, I'm kind of a bottom feeder when it comes to watches. I like the challenge of trying to find the best price for anything. I like the validation that I feel because I have, been interested in this for a while. I know where to go. I know strategies. But I think beyond that, let's set that aside. I mean, let's assume that I could get a discount or I could find a deal. Your question is, what would make me desire these brands? Because I'll tell you honestly, I'm very conscious, and this is something that doesn't get talked about in the luxury space, and I get it. In luxury, you're supposed to sort of portray yourself as removed from everything going on. But the fact is, I still have to walk down my streets. I still live in society. And I'm very conscious, more so than I have been, about what some of these status symbols say. So I think there's definitely kind of maybe a personal hang up there. But, it sounds kind of antithetical because I do like, tool watches, things that are practical, useful. But the luxury industry, and this is the last point I made in the article, is moving away from that. They've taken the paradigm suggested by Jean-Claude Biver, which is we are not tools anymore, we are items of desire, and they have run with it. So I would say the short answer, Alan, to you is that in order to make me desire these brands more, it would be to go back to what mechanical watches were before, to an extent, obviously not entirely. And then if that involves a new line, maybe, pricing that accordingly, and then try to get back towards more of that tool heritage.
It sounds to me like you're saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'll ask this as a question, but you can't unhook the pricing strategy of a brand from the products. Now, I guess what I want to know is if, for example, the Ingenieur were 6,000 and the Eternal Calendar were in any way affordable, would you have desire for that brand? Would it change your perception of a brand significantly to feel like the brand knows its consumer, it's listening to the market, and it wants us to be excited about these pieces and it wants us to be able to buy them? Or is it product related, or is it just entirely price focused?
Ooh, fantastic question. Well, I think that the deal with, the 12,000 euros is that to me, it's a non-starter. And again, like, look, I'm not going to share my bank statements with anyone, but like, I'm in a very good position, like a very good position. And yet 12,000 to me, it's a non-starter. If you get down to 6, and this is for example, Rob, the 6 you threw out, for example, to me, that becomes more compelling because it's something that with some prioritizing, some saving, some selling, I can definitely get there. So for what I think the target market is, and I'd like to think I'm in it for, a brand like IWC, it'd be fine. And the other point too, and this is important, I don't make any distinction between a 6,000 euro watch and a 12,000 euro watch. Like for the same product, I do at no point in my mind do I ever think that I would value it more twice the price than the 6,000 you proposed. To me, it's the difference literally between I might be able to get this one day and like, no, this is interesting, but it's in one ear out the other because it's not feasible.
But just to clarify, one important point, you would spend theoretically 12,000 on a watch, like, because that's important. Because if you're sort of saying, oh, well, there's just an upper price bracket to me, then it's kind of irrelevant, right?
So that's a great clarification. I would say there, again, going back to my point, I will never be able to afford everything. That's just life. I'm gonna choose my favorite brand just to get people's blood pressure up. I look at a Hublot. Hublot for 12, I think seems fair because they've got materials and movements, things like that. I understand that this price is what it is, and so maybe one day in the distant future, I might see myself doing that. But just real quick before I turn it over to Alon, is like as I said in the article, life is expensive, and so just kind of living takes up a big chunk of the budget. That will only get more expensive. Watch prices appear like they will only continue to rise. And so, Rob, to your point, it's like, would I ever spend 12 grand on a watch? Maybe, but it's difficult to imagine, in the current environment of what's happening, that's a realistic thing I would do.
So I've been dying to ask you quite some time, not would you buy a Yema watch, but why haven't you yet? And this question became so relevant in this discussion. So, do you own a Yema already?
So I do. So I will answer that, and then I think you had a follow up. I own so this is going to be very appropriate to what I've been saying all episode. So I own I think it's discontinued, the Yema Flygraph M2, which is the gray dial version of the watch they made a couple years back. It retailed, I think, for like 900 euros, but they were doing some kind of summer sale, clear out, whatever. I think I paid 550 for it. So I got my watch and I got a screaming deal.
So first of all, congrats. Second of all, shame on you. You didn't share it in the...
Oh, this was years ago. I've had this for a while. Yeah, no recent. I should clarify. No recent purchase of a Yema. This was years ago.
So then, what does it take for you to purchase a current manufacturer Yema? Let me rephrase that.
So look, tangentially, and I did share this in the WhatsApp. I did buy one Omega Aquaterra recently. So I sold one thing, got another. So net, I was basically zero additional watches. So Alan, to answer your question, I think that the Yema watches as they are currently, it's a relatively unknown brand, but my summary is that I think they're fairly priced. And, there's the added benefit of the fact I'm French, they're French, and that's a point of pride. But I think this is the problem, right, for the watch industry as I see it, is that I'm kind of at the point where I realize these watches, the ones I own, I've got my Cartier Santos on my wrist now. They're super well made. I don't need anything more. And if I do spend, $1.5, $2 grand, that is, relatively doable for me. Like, I'm tying it up, and the watch is probably going to sit in the watch box. It's not going to be fully utilized to its fullest potential. So I'm asking myself now, do I even need more watches? And that only becomes more and more of a question as the price for these things goes higher and higher up. Rob, what do you think?
Well, I hope this isn't your last episode of the Real Time Show.
I know I should probably show them out now, right? Yeah.
No, I mean, I think, and I hate to labor the same point again, but I think it's really important that we drill down into what we mean by these pricing comparisons, because it's one thing to have like a top limit and say, well, I will never spend that amount of money on a watch regardless of the watch. I think that what we're really saying is that one of Alon's favorite words, the delta between the perceived value of the watch and the cost to get it on your wrist is way, way, way too wide in these reputational brands that are streaking away from real life and almost impossible to obtain. And what that does, and I would say optimistically, is it does create a space where newer brands can create products with excellent actual value and with a good bit of creative marketing perceived value to go along with it. But that is the issue that they face now, because where do these smaller, more dynamic, creative brands with maybe more transparent pricing structures get their wares discussed? Because just to take it onto a slightly a media-focused topic, I think that the current industry, as depressing as it can be on many levels for many of us, is offering an opportunity to independent media platforms like The Real Time Show, a small media platform that is able to speak freely without having crazy overheads to keep the lights on. We are able to go out there and do the old traditional journalistic grunt work, finding out what's new, what's exciting, what's interesting, what deserves people's attention and cash. While the reputational brands seem to be using that incredible marketing budget that they're generating from these massive deltas between value and cost to invest in the established mainstream media platforms that are becoming, I'm concerned, a little bit like third-party advertising arms for the more traditional watchmakers. Do you see, David, any optimism in this for watch collecting as a pure pursuit, shall we say?
Yeah, and actually, the fact that the three of us can get around a virtual table and say what we do about a lot of these brands, I think it's a rare thing. And me personally, I appreciate that you both just give me the freedom to kind of run with my thoughts, because I don't think we see a lot of that. Interestingly enough, one of the things that did not make it into the final article was I was sort of thinking about some of the other topics we had discussed, and one of them was Omega versus Longines. And for those who haven't listened to this, the summary was that Omega seems to have kind of lost its way. Longines is doing fantastically. And then that got me thinking, like, okay, if someone had a budget of, say, $1,000 to spend on a watch, like, who would I suggest? And I'm thinking Tissot, Hamilton, Longines, if you have a little more money. And what's interesting is Swatch does not, as far as I know, exhibit at this event. So maybe there's some like 4D chess going on I'm not aware of with Swatch. Maybe they're not saying it, but true to their heritage of the Swatch watch, which democratized watches back in the 80s, maybe that's, I understand they own Breguet, they own Blancpain, they own some other ones, but the focus seems to be on these still very accessible brands that make exactly what I talked about, affordable tool watches. And so I would say, as I'm thinking about where's the optimism, it's there. And it makes good business sense too, because even though I understand that all the money might be even more and more concentrated, you can still do well with the mass market. That's what Longines did, particularly in Asia. And now they are moving up and making watches that I absolutely would buy if I had something like $2.5 in my pocket and I was looking for a great piece of horological engineering.
The thing is, Longines is moving into the space vacated by Omega. Like, Swatch Group is going in the same direction. And I don't think politically we'll ever see them present their wares at Watches and Wonders, given who's behind the organization. But Omega's a perfect example of one of these brands that's just streaking off into the distance and position itself out of reach for most people. Longines is creeping up there. Hamilton and Satina, maybe Mido, good examples of brands that are still very affordable and offer a great deal of bang for the buck, given the economy of scales that they have on their side because of being part of the Swatch Group. But, is that really what we are looking at now as like the meat of the watch industry? Like this is the lifeblood, like a brand like Hamilton, like Longines, they don't do anything particularly exciting. Surely now is the opportunity for the real avant-garde dynamic designers that commit themselves to creating challenging aesthetics to rise to the top with good communication. They need platforms, they need help for that, but there is worthwhile stuff happening in the watchmaking industry at a price point that has now been vacated by all of these reputational brands.
Yeah, I mean, the other name, I think, Rob, that's kind of carrying a lot of the water is Tudor, and I know how much you love the Ranger. So, I guess shout out to the Ranger for carrying the watch industry forward and providing good tool watches. But I think Omega is a great one because in 2018, that's when they relaunched the Seamaster 300 meter, and that had been like I had never liked that watch, just never paid attention to it, and they released it at like I think it was like 5,000 euros at the time. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. And I saw it in a case and I was like, yeah, okay, I get it now. That watch is fantastic. Like even now, you can find them all day. And, plugged for Alon, even though he's not paying me to say this, but I know he's got several at Ace pre-owned. They're all very well priced. You can get a 300 meter all day for between like 4,000 and 4,500 euros. That is a phenomenal piece of watchmaking. Like that got my attention. That got the industry's attention. And I'm assuming that someone on Omega ran the calculations like, okay, if we increase the price of this, 10% every year or whatever the number was, are we going to get, is the elasticity such that we're still going to get more revenue, keeping in mind people will drop off from the purchase? I hope someone ran that calculation, but Omega is a fantastic example because they do have the history of releasing absolutely phenomenal watches for excellent prices. And it seems to have worked. And like you said, Rob, they're streaking up. And the danger is that as they do that, they increase the prices. Those watches sit in cases. They end up at the gray market and brand equity tanks in the end. So there's a real risk there.
Maybe there's a risk of that happening, but perhaps they're focused on just reducing the volumes of the pieces so heavily that the increase in prices won't actually hit them on the bottom line in the same way as it might if they completely push it too far and end up with no customers whatsoever. I mean, I see this echelon of watchmakers, and I include brands like Zenith and IWC in it. It's a bit like a snake, like shedding its skin as it grows. And it's kind of a necessary thing in a way to shed all those old customers and focus on more prized customers. As a snake gets bigger, it can hunt bigger and bigger animals, and it leaves gaps in the nature, in the jungles, in the forests for smaller predators to sneak through and to have success where previously they might not have been able to. And I see that as a massive opportunity. I think that the soul of watchmaking is kind of at stake at this point. And I think that when I look to brands, I'm going to just name drop my favorites because I always do, because they're great examples of it, like Anordain, like Schofield. I tell you another Danish brand, not Arcanaut, although Arcanaut does fit into this category as well, but Vitrium, who are doing similar things to Anordain. Excellent prices for a solidly built watch with real artisanal handcraft in it. Like that to me is where the real collectors should be focused now. Not on Hamilton, not on Satina, not on Mido, but on real creative watchmaking.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think that's where the interesting stuff is happening. But, in the same way that the average guy isn't looking for, the next hot, Japanese designer or Belgian designer, they just want like a good shirt to wear to work. I just don't know. Like, I think the mass market is, I guess what I'm saying is I struggle to see one of these brands really making it to the big time, like the kind you see in the airports, right? And I think that is still an important piece. And Rob, it looks like you have, okay. Yeah, Rob, sorry, it looks like you have a response. And then I want to throw this back to Alon because I've got a question where I think he's going to be well positioned to answer.
Yeah, so I just want to ask you both, totally agree, but what does a newer brand have to do to get to that level? Because if we're saying that they have to stay in touch, their pricing has to stay in touch with the value of the product, and people are more concerned about getting that bang for their buck and the transparency of a pricing structure, what do they have to do to get up to that point where they are as much a part of the general psyche as a brand like Omega? Is it impossible?
It's difficult. I mean, a brand like the Space One is a cool watch. It's a great watch. Anordain makes cool stuff. But like, that's not the mass market. I mean, to be in the mass market, you have to make something that is relatively conservative from a design point of view. And this is, okay, I should couch this. My hypothesis is that to break into the mass market, it's got to be relatively conservative, well-built, and have a certain amount of brand equity. And I think that all of these micro brands are starting off, which is fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with it, but they're starting off from the point of targeting a niche. So how you then pivot to, I'm going to move from niche to mass market is very difficult.
I suppose that pretty much everything in watchmaking certainly this era of watchmaking as a collector's field started out as slightly niche. I mean, the heritage brands that we're talking about, you can't fake their history. They've been around for that amount of time. They've always been present. Like the biggest ones are like largely continuously operational. Many of them obviously had down periods during the quartz crisis and have come back, roaring back to success. But I think it must be possible for a brand to establish brand equity in this climate when these reputational brands are exiting that market entirely. Like they're not, it's all well and good that Omega or Rolex or Patek has enough money to plaster their logo across the side of a cruise ship or on a skyscraper or all over the airport. But if you can't buy one, you can't buy one. And that's not going to change anything. There has to be, what concerns me is that it's a very hard balance to strike to make a watch that is good value to the consumer, that doesn't have the necessary air in the price to invest in the kind of marketing drives that these bigger brands have more and more and more cash to invest in. So you're becoming pushed to the fringes of people's consciousnesses because you just don't have that cash because you're not bleeding them dry at the point of sale. So yeah, creative marketing, social media, YouTube, I don't know, there's a lot of negativity around a lot of these older school platforms now. But again, it comes back to responsible media, real journalists getting in there and putting this stuff out into the community. Because when we say mass market and mainstream, I don't think what I'm really suggesting is the brand like, Anno Dane could suddenly have the volume of Omega and compete with it. But I mean, it could become more of a mainstream choice within the watch community that has enough willing buyers with enough free cash that they don't want to spend on a 10 grand Speedmaster to invest in something like that and really propel that segment of the market to great things in the near future.
So the two brands I could think of that have really become mainstream, like Daniel Wellington and MVMT. So think about that. And they did that off the back of, I think, basically Instagram marketing.
But where are they now?
No, exactly. And I think, so as Daniel Wellington, I'm not sure. I know MVMT was sold to Movado, right, for something like $250 million. So, Alan, I'll let you roll with that. I just want to make one more point, though. Timex just released, it was a collab with James Brand, $750 gets you, this was yesterday, as the time of this recording, gets you a fully titanium flyer style GMT, right? Now, Timex is not an unknown brand, but they've, did collabs. Todd Snyder was a huge deal. It's taken years to kind of build up to this point. And that is a watch, 750 euros. That is 100% within my reach and my grasp. So I just think more of that.
So what I think is I've recently listened to the podcast episode of A Blog to Watch Superlative between Ariel Adams and the head purchasing of Luxury Bazaar. And they were talking about how pricing of second-hand market was going up and down. FP Journe, Richard Mille, that those were the only two that made it to the Grail list of the Holy Trinity, and how they did it. And basically they came, in my humble opinion, to a rather sad conclusion that it was market making, meaning it was hyped strategically for FP Journe. A long time, they weren't doing above lists, not that wanted. And then they were saying that Govborg with Watchbox, today called 1916, I believe, sucked everything out of the market and started hyping FP Journe. And they've been retrying that with De Bethune, taking it to the next level by buying the brand. Then Richard Mille, the conclusion was that it wasn't so much artisanal, which FP Journe is. So that's the artist, and people buy into the art and the artist. And the buyers for Richard Mille are less inclined to buy the technology or design, but simply because RM and the people behind the brand knew how to hype it, meaning don't oversaturate the market so there's no discounts. Make sure you have the right retailers, right influencers, put it on the wrists of Nadal, Formula One drivers, Pharrell, etc. So, in my humble opinion, that is a black swan. It's very rare, very difficult to replicate. I don't think it's easy to replicate or even can be done in the next decade. What brands should do, in my humble opinion, is whereas in retail, we used to say it's location, 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 doesn't fly anymore. I do think that in luxury, it's quality, 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 meaning quality of product, quality of design, quality of innovation, and just be persistent. And then what comes to mind is the beautiful work Rob and crew at Argonaut are doing grinding. Think of our friend Martin Klokke at Sherpa Watch. What he's doing is grinding. What you need to do is keep on repeating your message. Get the message out. And that's why I love what we do here is getting the unknown stories out into the world. So those were my 2 cents. I think that we should slowly wrap it up. Before I hand you the mic, David, you guys said one of the words I love. Well, I've been apparently accumulating a few of them because in the TRTS network, they even made a sound bite out of one of them. So maybe we should offer them like, a sticker package you can offer on Instagram or WhatsApp. Maybe we should make TRTS sound bites that people can play as GIFs or whatever. Rob, what do you think?
I absolutely like it. Yeah, we'll have to put a label on it to make sure that nobody under the age of 18 purchases the particular soundbite you're referring to. I might drop it in at the end of the show so people know what we're talking about. But we have a few, don't we? We have my catchphrase is fascinating, which normally comes out at least 3 times an episode. Yours is Delta, Tutti Frutti, and we'll play the other one at the end.
Revolution, evolution.
Evolution, oh God, yeah, there's a whole sticker pack there waiting to happen. We need David's catchphrase. I said, bonjour, tout le monde.
It's happy saying Hublot. I think
Hublot. Phonetically spelled Hublot sticker. I love it.
I think we should gift it to Hublot, you saying that, and that should teach the world, school the world how to pronounce it.
All right. David, final thoughts, please, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, no, so I think, Alan, Richard Mille is a fantastic example. I think that their marketing is fantastic. I do appreciate their watches, knowing I will never be able to afford them. They've done a very specific thing for themselves. But I think that's the point. Everyone is maybe trying to be Richard Mille, even if they don't think that's what they are. And I think the watch industry is a little bit poor for it. I don't think there's any shame in selling a product that is less expensive than a Richard Mille, but still does a very good job. Does a different job, but a good job. And so I hope going forward that, and in subsequent Watches and Wonders and just, industry talk, I hope we can get back to a little bit more of the variety that I've got used to seeing until very recently.
Well. Everybody wants to be Richard Mille. I didn't expect this Audicle analysis to end on such a devastating note. But I personally think that this is an interesting era of watchmaking into which we're entering. I think we don't always have to look to the past and point to things that have happened before, because this is still a relatively young industry in its current guise. And it's totally possible that we're going to see something that we've never seen before. And I do believe that there's an opportunity here. I believe that, every part of the watch ecosystem has its role to play, the designers and the journalists and the retailers as well, which is something I'm sure we'll talk more about in the next Audicle analysis that's coming soon. I'm hopeful. I really am. I see what's happening. It leaves a sour taste in my mouth. I'm frustrated that I can't buy some of the pieces that I would like to buy, but I know there's so much good work being done around the corners of the industry that all it takes is a bit more endeavor. If you're a consumer looking for a good value product that's possibly going to be, at least, if not a classic in industry terms, something that warms your heart for many years to come, because that's what we want from our watches. And this slightly cold analytical discussion about pricing and value is not really what we want to be dedicating our lives to. We want to be talking about exciting design and emotionally challenging products. So if you'd like to get involved in the discussion, then please do join the WhatsApp network, the Real-Time Network. You can do that by sending us a message either on our dedicated Instagram handle at therealtime.show or via email to either Alon, Rob, or David at therealtime.show, or via the contact form on the website, www.therealtime.show. Please like, follow, subscribe, and share the podcast with all your watch-loving friends or people looking for the next big thing. Until next time, stay safe and keep on ticking. It's amazing after all this time I can still fuck up the ending.
Stingy fox.